much. Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today. It is Messaging Strategies for a Changing DEI Landscape, Insights from Colleges and Public Funders. We can go to the next slide. I am Keisha Wright-Frazier, President and CEO at Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. CSW is a national workforce policy nonprofit. We're nearing our 34th year, so we're very excited about that. And we're here today to seek out how equity messaging can be used to defend and otherwise advance equity, especially when we're talking about racial equity, on behalf of students, families, and communities. Primarily, we're looking at what are public funders doing, colleges, how are they framing their messages, how does that look in practice? And we're excited to share our initial findings with you today because there's a lot more work to do and we want to engage you collectively in that continued work. But we want to engage you today in a collective dialogue thanks to our funding partners at the NEE-KC Foundation. And I'm eager for you to hear from a group of dynamic speakers today. We have some remarks from Connie Fuller, Senior Associate at NEE-KC Foundation, and I'll introduce her more in a second. We want to go to slide 4. But you'll also hear from panel, which includes Dr. Jenny Poole, the initiative's primary researcher and report author. She's a senior policy associate at CSW. Keisha Jones, state director from the North Community College System. Cheryl Martin, manager of the Community College Investments Unit at the Department of Labor. And then Melissa Goldberg, director at CSW. Again, you'll get fuller introductions from them in just 1 second. I just want to highlight a couple key objectives from the learnings that we've got so far. And you can download the full report. You can put that back up on the QR code. I want to make sure folks have that information so you can download the full report here as we go deeper into that report and discussion today. All right, next slide. Just a couple of comments of why this matters to us in the work that we do at CSW. Most people know there's an evolving climate surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion across the states. It's not just embedded in a few places. As one time we would think there was a North against South. It's happening across the country. Recent legislation, court rulings, and actions by elected officials have increasingly threatened efforts to advance racial equity in higher ed and other sectors in the country, and you'll hear about that today. As we step back throughout our history, we see a pattern consistent of challenges to racial equity. 4 years ago, 2020, 2019, we seen progress, and then we saw some attacks against DEI. And that has major impacts, and it feeds into the current economic, education, and social status for minoritized communities. As of May 2024, there have been 10 bills that have been signed into law by a governor. 2 in Florida, 1 in each state of the Dakotas, 1 in Tennessee, 1 in Texas, 1 in Utah, 1 in Alabama, 1 in Idaho, and a very strong one in the state of Iowa. Since 2023, 86 bills have been introduced in 28 states and in the Congress. So again, this is pervasive across the country. We can't assume that this climate is limited to, again, particular states. We're seeing it evolving. And even in states that do not have anti-DEI legislation, Supreme Court rulings against affirmative action is spreading to nearby states. It's having a chilling effect. And again, you'll hear more about that chilling effect and how that dampers efforts, how that lands on students, and that, across the board, dampers the advancement of equity. In light of these challenges, there's a growing need for knowledge and discourse on how colleges and their partners can effectively leverage messaging, defend, and promote equity as a high imperative. The country at large is facing a labor shortage. That's one of the things we greatly focus on at CSW, and in particular in those middle skill levels. We need skilled workers. Everyone does. And messages that are not promoting inclusion can limit access to training and education, which hurts us all. In this research, we heard from colleges across the country about the effect that anti-DEI politics is having on their efforts to connect with their internal campus community and with external partners, such as anti-equity legislation, DEI surveillance, silencing equity discussions. Again, you can find a lot more as you read the report and go deeper there. We also know that colleges face challenges every day trying to do better by students and communities, which are compounded by anti-DEI politics and activism. There are competing needs in addition to the anti-DEI politics, lacks of scalable practices, data capacity challenges, partner constraints, and funding challenges, amongst a host of other challenges. Again, this matters to us because it greatly aligns with our mission and values in which every person is able to earn a family-sustaining income, achieve upward mobility, and adapt to the future. We want you all to get in this dialogue with us and contribute to meaningful discussion on how we can defend and advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, especially racial equity, and encourage support for future work by colleges, funders, and other nonprofits who also share in these values. I'd like to turn things over to our partner funder, Quanique Fuller, Fuller. She's a senior associate at the Annie Casey Foundation. And she leads a body of work focused on supporting parents as they pursue workforce and education. She also manages a portfolio designed to improve equitable outcomes for students of color in higher education. Thanks for joining us today, Quanique, and thanks again for your support.
Absolutely. Thank you, and good afternoon to all of those joining. I'm Quanique Fuller with the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and I have the honor of welcoming you all to this timely conversation on equity. To begin, I'd like to say a few words about the Casey Foundation and why we're focusing on community colleges. So the Casey Foundation is focused on building a brighter future for children and young people of color. We're committed to ensuring that all young people, no matter their race, their background, or zip code, can fully realize their potential. In the US, there are nearly 16 million students pursuing credentials, associate's, or bachelor's degrees. These students are incredibly diverse, and it's especially when we compare them to previous generations of college goers. There are more students of color, more first-generation learners, more low-income students, more students who work part-time, and more students who are raising children. These are the new majority learners. And when we pause to think about where these students enroll in school, we see that nearly half of undergraduates attend community colleges. They actively seek out these two-year institutions because they're just a short drive from their homes. They have open admissions policies. They also offer lower tuitions. Equally important, these schools provide students the flexibility they need to balance work and other responsibilities. It's also important to note that community colleges are trusted and vital players in their local economies. They provide skills training to prepare the local workforce. Yet when we start to think about the challenges that students face, we see that they face some huge barriers that almost jeopardize their ability to gain academic and skills training. For example, most students of color cannot rely on their families to pay tuition or help them with living expenses. They face high rates of basic needs insecurity, which includes food, transportation, and housing. Today's students often take out debt to finance their education. We also know that more than 30% of undergraduates leave college without a degree. And for those who do graduate, they often face labor market discrimination. And so where does this lead us? Well, the Casey Foundation is supporting strategies to help young people navigate the transition into adulthood and to achieve economic stability. One way we do this is by identifying and promoting systemic practices that accelerate the attainment of a credential or degree, while also ensuring that students have the financial means and supportive services to address their basic needs. We further center the institutions that serve these students in our strategy. We seek to ensure that community colleges and minority-serving institutions have the funding and resources to adopt student success reforms and to address their student needs. And for these reasons, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to partner with CSW to elevate the strategies that community colleges can continue to use to promote equity in post-secondary education and workforce environments. This conversation is extremely timely, and I'm happy to know that so many of you continue to do the great work of pushing equity in your institutions. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to CSW to share their new research.
Keisha, you're muted.
Yep, I'm unmuting myself again. Thanks so much, Kwanique, for joining us and again for your support. I want to get right into the report and introduce Jenny Poole. She's a senior policy associate with our competencies and credentials team at CSW. She focuses on expanding the use of competencies and quality credentials to boost economic mobility for low-wage workers and address racial disparities. She brings over 12 years of experience leading research, technical assistance, and workshops for organizations like the American Institute for Research, University of Virginia, and U.S. Green Building Council. Jenny holds a Ph.D. and master's degree in higher ed from the University of Virginia. So Jenny, please dive in.
I will. Thank you, Keisha, and thank you, Kwanique, for the introduction today. And thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. So for the next about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to share a series of strategies that we heard about while conducting research with community colleges and public funders. And I'm a researcher, I can be dense, but rest assured that all that I'm reviewing today is in our report. So if you don't catch something, that's okay. But I hope that sharing these strategies continues and maybe in some instances starts important conversations about how to advance equity, especially racial equity, in an evolving climate surrounding DEI. And if you go to the next slide. So from May 2023 to May 2023, we engaged in research with senior leaders, faculty, and staff as representatives of community colleges, as well as representatives from public funders to explore a series of questions, especially one, what approaches and messaging strategies work to gain buy-in and support for equity improvements? And what we found is that despite challenges such as anti-DEI legislation and political resistance, Supreme Court rulings happening across states, colleges are using messaging as a lever to advance equity, especially racial equity, through their partnerships. And we asked about partnerships with various parties. We heard about partnerships with industry, employers, community organizations, federal and state funders, philanthropy. And we also heard colleges talking a lot about the messaging they use internally within their campus communities. Next slide. So before I launch into the approaches that we heard about in our research, I want to point how it is that I have come to talk about these messaging or frames as strategic. Maybe leaning into effective, but not just yet. We did not test colleges' equity messaging strategies and efforts for effectiveness. Rather, when we were analyzing and reporting on strategies we heard from colleges and what I'm about to share, I consulted prior research on effective ways to engage in equity messaging, which actually comes from decades of empirical research on public opinion and political issues and political participation. So research from public opinion scholars, and actually an organization like the Frameworks Institute underscores the critical role of messaging and framing messages in shaping support for racial equity in higher education and the workplace. So, for example, there's a ton of research that's been done, particularly around the issue of affirmative action in higher ed and the workplace. And this body of research suggests that messaging can be more persuasive when it emphasizes the need for equity in a way that aligns with the values and ideologies of partners and audiences. So you'll hear me talk about quite a bit about that today. Next slide, please. So our report, which I hope you all will read, highlights these messaging approaches listed here and provides much more examples in the report as those that community colleges use to advance equity, especially racial equity, through strategic messaging, and framing is the term that gets used in prior research, and you can hear us use it today. By framing, I refer to how colleges describe equity, articulate their equity efforts, and communicate to advance equity both internally and with their external partners. And a key finding from our research is that colleges frame equity as a priority, while at the same time aligning with the values of their communities and partners. So rather than these approaches that I have listed here, varying based on geography or institutional size, what I found is that colleges' messaging strategies can vary based on messaging audience or the partner that they're looking to communicate with. And these are not the only possible ways for colleges to advance equity, right, through messaging. However, they are the ones we heard about most in our research. And in future research, it'll be really useful to learn more and deeper information about these frames and others that might exist. For example, ones that tie to a notion of transformational justice, equity, racial healing, that kind of thing. So next slide. So to begin, I'd like to start by discussing the first frame we encountered in our research, how colleges are describing anti-DEI legislation and politics as risks that need to be managed. Now, we all know, we've already talked about it on this call, that across the country, but especially in states that have passed or proposed anti-DEI legislation, community colleges are engaging in equity messaging that frames racial equity as a risk. However, when it's strategic, colleges are actually messaging and pursuing equity in ways that frame anti-DEI legislation, the rulings, the political activism, not racial equity itself as the risks to be managed. And how does this happen strategically? Well, we heard from interviewees that it's first about developing a specific understanding of the risk posed by anti-DEI politics, and second, by engaging in messaging that it matches the type and level of risk involved. And this approach is more strategic because it avoids overstating the risks, and it also doesn't obscure, maybe less likely to obscure possible solutions. And in our examples, we heard about colleges finding new mechanisms to sustain equity efforts. We also heard about examples of how colleges use data to highlight the impact of anti-DEI legislation and politics and political actors on their ability to serve students. You can go to the next slide. So I wanted to share this quote, which shows how one college with evidence and new funding continued a program for Black men students. This program, which was constructed with outside experts actually, was shut down by their board in response to anti-DEI politicians and their goals. And the person we spoke with noted that shutting down the program was demoralizing. It had improved retention for Black men, and continuing it felt like starting over, especially after a pandemic. Nevertheless, it was able to continue the program with support from its foundation. And it has now started to create similar programs for women, Latinx students, and others. And a key support here is about finding and creating streams of funding for equity programs. That's one mechanism to keep the work going in an evolving landscape surrounding DEI. And in this instance, the team found help restarting the program through fundraising for the program itself and its foundation. And other colleges described similar support from system level offices, and they also talked extensively about other grant opportunities. And you can go to the next slide. So colleges are also working to advance equity as the pursuit of equitable outcomes for Black, Latinx, and other students of color. They do so because of their missions and also because federal law requires it. I think it's worth reminding ourselves always that it's under federal civil rights law that students in American higher education cannot be denied the benefits of or subjected to discrimination based on race or ethnicity. And one significant way that colleges promote equitable outcomes for students of color in their efforts is by using data to highlight disparities, especially through discussions of equity gaps. I know all of you know this, but data often show that students of color are being excluded from the full benefits of post-secondary education and workforce training. In our research, we heard a lot about how colleges lead with data while describing their pursuit of equitable outcomes for students of color. So They're using outcomes or numbers to show that they're narrowing equity gaps or that equity gaps exist, and communicating that to various audiences. At the same time, prior research suggests that it's probably most strategic when colleges connect their use of data to shared values of their audiences. In fact, prior research cautions against the use of quote unquote naked numbers or data without context or a connection to shared values when you're making the case for racial equity. And actually, one of our interviews echoed this. The person said, people like data until it tells them something they don't like or disagree with, right? Which speaks to the idea of needing to make these connections to shared values. And in our research, we heard multiple examples of colleges using data and making connections to shared values to advance equitable outcomes for students of color. And if you can go to the next slide. So a key support for this kind of messaging involves the use of data, right? Colleges' ability to use data, having the systems to do so, and having funders supporting colleges' data capacity as grantees. For colleges, not surprisingly, data dashboards matter greatly to them being able to lead with data in their equity messaging. Strategic plans also matter as they include the college's racial equity goals and priorities and connections between those goals and priorities to key performance indicators, right? And this quote here speaks to how colleges are using messaging and data to make the case for race-conscious improvements. So one interviewee shared that because of their college's strategic plan and data dashboard, this person had the opportunity to engage in strategic conversations about Latinx students, their college's largest student population, who were self-selecting into education and training pathways leading into low-wage career occupations. And equipped with reports pulled from the college's dashboard, this interviewee explored race-conscious solutions in conversations with teams throughout the college. And they went around asking questions to understand the challenges and barriers faced by these students, right? So it's just one example from our research. And you could go to the next slide. So in addition to advancing equal outcomes for students of color, community colleges are also messaging and pursuing equity as the pursuit of increased workforce opportunities for their students, community college students. And this framing is used by community colleges in the process of removing barriers, improving access to employment, expanding career opportunities for current and prospective community college students. And their students are diverse. They include students of color, individuals from low-income backgrounds, rural residents, older adults, working adults, parents, right? Immigrant students, refugee students, and more. And this framing is commonly used by colleges to address gaps for these students as a collective who are all pursuing two-year degrees, potentially non-degree credentials and programs. So for example, colleges' senior leaders may use this messaging when, we actually heard a lot about this, colleges' senior leaders and workforce leaders are using this messaging when engaging with industry, right, to highlight the benefits of hiring community college graduates who are a diverse group, right? At the same time, prior research indicates that this frame might be most effective when used in a culturally responsive way in internal messaging to the campus community. And we did hear a lot about this in our research. This type of messaging is particularly useful for informing and even persuading or convincing community college students about available opportunities and essential wraparound supports. For example, we heard how colleges use this messaging to inform students about pathways to upward mobility. And we heard about staff members having conversations about students enrolling in 4-credit programs, or maybe the benefits, explaining to students the benefits of stackable IT credentials, right? And a key component of this messaging effort, I would say, is marketing. We heard a lot about marketing, and I have a little bit more to say about that on the next slide. And this quote here is an example of how colleges use messaging to talk to and convince prospective and current students of their access to opportunities with the help of marketing. And in our conversations, we heard a lot about colleges intentionally featuring diverse students, faculty, and other members of the campus community on banners, billboards, and even on radio ads. And what we heard is that colleges' marketing teams make this kind of messaging possible. So helping to translate qualitative and quantitative data points into visual media and storytelling. We also heard some other examples of how colleges communicate their accessibility to prospective students. For example, one college has hosted a Professionals of Color career conference for decades with the goal of showing students that the people who have the jobs you want look like you, the students who are participating in the programs. And another college deliberately hires diverse career navigators and coaches to visit and conduct local workforce-related programming in the high schools, ensuring that these programs and the folks who are representing the colleges reflect the diversity of their student bodies. And you can go to the next slide. 4 out of 5 frames. So there we go. Colleges are also in the position to message equity, and again, especially racial equity, while working with industry employers. And this includes industry and employers and other partners who may not share the same values regarding DEI and related goals. And so using this frame, colleges don't necessarily explicitly message racial equity as a priority or sort of, on behalf of Black, Latinx, and other students of color, right? Instead, racial equity is described as a lever for workforce efficiency, which is something that can advance the college's equity goals while working with their employer partners and advancing their specific goals. And in our report, I've used the term workforce efficiency as it's a broad umbrella term that covers various measures of workforce productivity, but I think the closest is probably something like matching efficiency, or the matching of job seekers to available jobs. And our interviews suggest that colleges use equity messaging to build connections with their employers and businesses, and they're often aligning their messaging with employers' discrete hiring needs. And one of our interviewees talked about it as, businesses are coming to us because they want to diversify their workforce, but this isn't philanthropy. This is their hiring strategy. This messaging was described as strategic by colleges, but prior research also would support the idea that equity messaging is aligned with the values of business and industry is more persuasive to employers. However, meeting employers where they're at does not mean avoiding the topic of racial equity. Instead, it's a little bit more like addressing employers' goals in ways that open lines of communication and willingness and give more opportunity to chip away at racial inequities, acknowledging industry and employer goals. So you can go to the next slide. And this quote reflects an example of how colleges use messaging to highlight inefficiencies in employer recruitment and retention and conduct trainings with their HR teams around racial equity. In our interviews, one college representative shared an example of how a manufacturing employer, without prompting from the college, connected to the college to develop a training program for employees of color, and in particular, individuals of East African descent. This program was intended to facilitate their upward mobility within the organization. And this interviewee noted that the employer doesn't necessarily share the same DEI values and language as the college or the representative we spoke with. However, the employer has, since the beginning of the partnership, demonstrated that they take the work seriously. That's the interviewee's term, seriously. The employer's primary interest lies in improving workforce efficiency by matching talent to jobs rather than directly addressing equity on behalf of students. And I just note that another mention of support here, folks were talking about funding. So this includes grant funding that's structured to bring colleges, employers, and other partners together to improve workforce efficiency. And I can think of multiple examples of funding that encompass racial equity for workers and workforce efficiency goals. Another example of funding that was described as supportive for this is funding that's available to colleges to co-construct training and educational programs with employers while also helping colleges meet their equity goals. You can go to the next slide. So in the last frame that I have to discuss today, and which is featured in our report, community colleges advance racial equity as the pursuit of place-based fairness for communities. And while I'm sort of out of time to go into detail right now about this, our report notes that this is a strategic frame for equity that could withstand scrutiny even by today's Supreme Court standards. And using this frame, colleges highlight the need to improve conditions for individuals living in communities facing education, training, employment, and even health disparities. In our interviews, we heard about colleges pursue, how they pursue messaging and equity for various communities like rural communities, where there's a need for greater access to high-wage programs that lead to economic mobility, HUD designated high poverty, rural, urban, and tribal promise zones, and city neighborhoods disproportionately affected by violence, including gun violence and police brutality. And in our research, we saw how colleges strategically advance equity through their attempts at deep, sustainable place-based initiatives. And in doing so, they embrace their role as anchor institutions, which is a concept I think many people probably know about, but if not, look it up. It's also referenced a little bit more in our report. And as anchor institutions, colleges are leveraging their resources to improve the long-term well-being of their communities. And in recent years, a lot of the current anchor institution research probably focuses on four-year institutions and like colleges with big academic medical centers. But in recent years, community colleges have gained increasing recognition for their roles as anchor institutions, particularly in connection with community and economic development. And so colleges across the country are advancing place-based fairness by building strong relationships with their local communities and working in coalitions to drive impact. You can go to the next slide. So we heard multiple examples of place-based strategies in our research, and I'd say two stand out as worth highlighting today. So in one example, which is what this quote here is referencing, one of our interviewees emphasized the importance of having boots on the ground or local personnel who can provide residents with one-on-one information on education, training, and services. So this college had actively expanded access to folks in the community by opening multiple campuses and service centers in neighborhoods that have historically been excluded from opportunities. However, feedback from the community members indicated that many were still unaware of the education and training and services available to them right in their own neighborhood. So now in response, the college is working to improve outreach, hiring more individuals from these neighborhoods and collaborating more closely with faith-based organizations. Another example came from a college that's part of a city-specific workforce coalition, which includes the college's non-credit workforce division, the Chamber of Commerce, and others. The coalition focuses on workforce needs in the city, and its initiatives are designed to ensure that opportunities are accessible and within reach for community members. Next slide, please. So, and you can read more about these supports in our report, but before we move on to our panel for today, I want to have a couple of slides here to talk briefly about some of our other findings. So across interviews, at the top of this presentation, we're talking about the numerous challenges that exist. I've talked about some messaging strategies that exist. We've also heard about multiple factors that facilitate community colleges' ability to leverage equity messaging with partners. And I mentioned you can read more about these in our report, but I will spend a little bit of time talking about one today because our research suggests that funders play a really important role in keeping colleges committed to pursuing racial equity as a post-secondary and workforce imperative through these strategies, but what I'll also talk about on my next two slides. So next slide, please. So As I mentioned before, I didn't mention, but we did hold conversations with public funders as a part of this research. And, asked questions about how do funders help establish equity as an imperative for colleges and other grantees. And one key way is by tying equity information and data to their funding, which includes but is not just limited to the idea or use of equity metrics. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to understand how equity metrics and data can be used to support the ongoing pursuit of racial equity in various ways, including sort of the different ways we've laid out in this presentation. However, tying equity data and metrics to funding does compel and support colleges and other grantees to prioritize equity. For example, funders require colleges and other grantees to describe who will benefit from the funding if awarded, right? Multiple federal agencies use this approach in grant applications and announcements aimed at improving diversity and addressing equity gaps through sector-based strategies. In our research, one example that came up is that 2 colleges were asked by their states or cities to specify how they would use grant funding to improve educational outcomes in predominantly Black neighborhoods, particularly those disproportionately affected by COVID-19. In another example, funders require grantees to choose a specific population, group of people experiencing inequitable education or workforce outcomes. Maybe they're asked to choose a metric that they can use to guide their goals and track efforts to improve outcomes for this group. And funders also require grantees receiving year-over-year dollars to submit disaggregated data on race and ethnicity. And we heard about this as the purpose for this is both tracking purposes, building capacity, but also for the purposes of conducting impact evaluations. You can go to the next slide. And our report also reviews a handful of other examples of how public funders help establish equity as a priority for colleges and other grantees. And examples of this include directing grants to specific types of organizations or institutions. So for example, those that are BIPOC led or represents, serve students of color. Public funders use the pursuit of equitable outcomes for students and workers of color as criteria for deciding which proposals to fund. This can also actually often includes asking grantees to identify evidence-based strategies that are known to improve such outcomes. And I think what we heard as really supportive is that funders have grant opportunities geared towards building capacity with regards to equity. So in our interviews, and people know that this already exists, we've learned about how they work with colleges and other grantees to build the capacity to use data, for example. And I would say that we also heard about how technical assistance coupled with this kind of funding can help colleges and other grantees delve into this notion of deep equity. So moving beyond maybe more superficial use of metrics to a more meaningful use of equity data. And I know I'm someone who is currently engaged in technical assistance projects and knows that I'm excited to see more technical assistance happening around all that I've had a chance to present today. So to leave enough time for our panel and Q&A, I'm going to stop there, but hope I've given you some thoughts in terms of thinking about improving current efforts and perhaps moving to a more intentional way of messaging equity. And so on that note, I'll turn it back over to Keisha, who's going to introduce Melissa Goldberg from our team.
Thank you, Jenny. Everyone, feel free to place any questions for Jenny in the question box. It's there if you have any issues there. Message one of the team members, but we love your questions. I'm going to get right into it and introduce Melissa Goldberg. She's going to moderate our panel. Melissa is the Director of Competencies and Credentials at CSW. She leads efforts to expand the use of competencies and credentials to improve economic mobility for low-wage workers and to reduce racial disparities. With over 20 years of experience, Melissa has advised policymakers, industry leaders, and educators on strategies to enhance workforce development and student outcomes. She has worked with community colleges, foundations, and federal agencies nationwide to drive impactful change in education and workforce systems. Turning it over to you, Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Keisha. And thank you, Jenny, for sharing your fascinating findings. I now have the pleasure of introducing our panel, where we can hear from Jenny and two leaders who are deeply involved in this equity conversation, one from higher education and the other from a public policy perspective. Before I introduce our panelists, I'm going to put a +1 on Keisha's reminder to members of the audience to please post any questions that you might have for the speakers and panelists in the Q&A panel. So, and we'll get to as many of them as we can during the Q&A discussion after the panel. But now on to our panelists. So Keisha Jones is a visionary leader in the fields of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging and leadership strategy. She has worked in higher education for many years and currently serves as the Associate Vice President of Student Affairs and the Chief Student Services Officer and Chief Diversity Officer at Davidson Davies Community College. And she also works as the State Director of Inclusive Excellence with the North Carolina Community College System under the North Carolina Student Success Center umbrella. Cheryl Martin is a program manager for the community college investments at the U.S. Department of Labor, Employment and Training Administration. She manages a team for strengthening community colleges training grants, scaling apprenticeship grant programs, and critical sectors job quality grants. Her team also mentioned the $2 billion Trade Adjustment Assistant Community College and Career Training, or TACT grant program from 2011 to 2018. And so, as you can see from both of them, I'm sure they'll have a lot to contribute. So welcome, Keisha and Cheryl. And I'd like to start by asking each of you to please take a minute to share with us why this topic of equity messaging holds meaning for you. And Keisha, why don't you start?
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, depending on where you're located. Good morning, maybe if you're located somewhere else. This is important to me because it aligns with my value system. If I think about, I've been in higher education at this point for 20 years. I've worked in the 4-year sector and the 2-year sector. And so I've had a lot of experiences. I have a child that has had experiences in higher education. And so for me, making sure that people have access to accomplish the goals and the things that they desire, and then ultimately contribute to the communities in which they live is extremely important for me. But the biggest piece of that is about that access and being able to have access to that. And then while you're in those spaces, feel like you belong and be an inclusive environment. So for me, it very much so aligns with my value system and what I think is important, just in general.
Thank you. And Cheryl, why don't you jump in and same question.
Thank you. Speaking as a representative of DOL, I wanted to step back and offer a little bit of context at the DOL level on this, in that DOL's grant programs, both formula and discretionary, have been focused on serving underserved individuals for many years. Much of our focus on targeted populations and communities is legislated, like in WIOA or legislation like that. So it's kind of baked in there, so to speak. But since the executive orders on equity, DOL and other agencies are really taking a much closer look at this topic. So that's been over the last 3+ years. And one of the things that came out of that, I think it'll be plugged into the resources a little bit later, is a report that we just did on equity and grant making, a review of barriers and strategies for funders considering improvement opportunities. So just mentioning that. That's an environmental scan that DOL did to look at what other federal agencies are doing to support equity. And it was done to inform our own efforts at DOL. And I would just say then that across many agencies, the general idea is that the value around this is that increasing equity and grant making can help diversify the organizations and communities that receive all these billions of dollars of grant funding each year. And by adding these new perspectives and voices, funders may further strengthen the equity of the grant funded programs themselves. So it's that. I can give you some examples of what we've done. I don't know if you want those now or if you want those a little bit later, Melissa.
Why don't we dive into those in a few minutes? But I actually, even though she's already shared her findings with us, I actually want to hear from Jenny as well.
Yeah, sure. So this topic holds meaning for me. I think certainly aligns, as Keisha mentioned, with my values, but also as someone, I think a lot about like my training in higher ed, and so much of it being hinging on this idea of a really an unfulfilled promise and systems that have not worked as they should. And the other piece I would note too is for this particular project, I think that it's providing additional language and frameworks and ways of thinking and talking about equity that I don't think are brand new to people, but sometimes based on your own role or the environment, and you really think about equity in one way. And so what I've really appreciated is I just think that talking about language and frameworks that are used can be empowering to people regardless of where they sit within an organization. And so I'm hoping that our work is doing some of that.
Great. Well, thank you all. Keisha, I'm going to turn to you, and I'm just wondering if you can share a bit about what you're doing in North Carolina related to equity from your vantage point, both as a community college practitioner and as leading efforts for the state community college system.
Yes, so from a community college level practitioner perspective, for me, it's about embedding equity into all aspects of the work that we do and everything that we do, from policy development to direct student support services. Even when we think about our faculty and staff, I think that's a piece that is missing sometimes when we think about creating equitable opportunities, places that are inclusive and places where students belong. We leave the faculty staff experience out of it. And so I'm a big advocate in thinking about the work that I do within my own institution is that I can't create an inclusive environment where students belong if my faculty and staff do not feel included and like they belong in that space. It is very difficult for them to create a space where they don't feel like they have that for somebody else. So for us, specifically at the community college level, it is really about embedding equity in everything and everything that we're doing. Why are we doing it? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to change? What implications are we potentially creating by a new policy or process or procedure? So how are we embedding that, even down to the furniture that we purchase, the buildings that we are renovating or building, new buildings we may be renovating? How are we embedding equity into those components across? From a state level, it's pretty much the same type of messaging, except it goes a little deeper. I don't think you can really make changes or shift, especially in the current climate that we're in, if you haven't properly assessed what your current efforts are. What have you been doing? How have you been doing? Why? Like your first question, I think is extremely important, especially for an institution. So from a state level, that's always my first question. What's your institutional why? Why is this important? Because when you're thinking about pushing this at your institution and getting people to buy in, administration needs to be able to communicate why is this work important. So really helping them dig into what that is, but also providing them with a framework and how to do that work. I think a lot of people confuse the work with a lot of professional development opportunities and cultural awareness events, but it's deeper than that. And so really giving colleges a toolkit in how to literally start the work and make sure that you're intentional and you're strategic in the work. And how do you align the work into the initiatives that you already have at your institution without your campus feeling like, oh, this is one more thing that we're doing. And no, it's not one more thing. It's a part of what we're doing on a regular basis. And then how do you demonstrate equity in action? I think a lot of times people can't see themselves in the work or can't see the importance of the work because we don't articulate or properly articulate what we're doing to accomplish equity initiatives, right? While racial equity, I think, is extremely important, and you can't have these conversations without talking about race. I think there are other things that we do every day on our campuses and within our institutions that impact equitable opportunities, create inclusive environments. But if you're not communicating that out and you're not celebrating those small wins, of the things that you have been able to accomplish, then it's very hard for you all to try to accomplish things. And then when you're thinking about legislation from a state perspective, it's really helping them interpret what that means, what they can do, how does that impact the work that they're doing. So that's kind of where I am when I think about what I do within an institution and then what I do from a state level.
Well, thank you. And just some of the things that you were highlighting there about having this whole sense of the why and having that permeate the conversation, and it feels so authentic in that way. And then, you know, ensuring that you're engaging the faculty and staff in all of this, that they are a part of this. So you're modeling all of this within your work, and then that toolkit about showing people how. I think it's just great lessons and ideas for others to think about. Cheryl, what's DOL doing around equity right now?
Well, thank you for asking. DOL has done a lot of things in the last few years to really home in on this. And I'll just list some of them, like stakeholder listening sessions to and open forums to share challenges with applying for grants. And, you know, in listening to Keisha, it's like you're from a college perspective and this is from a very different perspective. So it's just interesting to see how these things intersect, right? But anyway, directed outreach to underrepresented grantee organizations, including tribes or smaller nonprofits and community organizations, both from the national office where I work and from our regions. One of the things we've tried to do is to make match easier and removed match for certain grants for certain applicants where it could get in the way, such as tribes when they're applying to a youth build grant, for example. We've tried to go for longer open periods for our funding opportunity announcements when we can, and using a reopen approach with the funding opportunity announcement so that we use an amendment to signal a second open period, so that gives people a longer heads up for planning purposes, and also, you know, allows people to try again if they want to reapply for a grant. Using a mix of developing and scaling grants so that newer grantees can get their feet under them in terms of establishing partnerships and that kind of thing. And, you know, simple or not so simple things, as the case may be, like updating our DOL website to make finding information about grants easier. But we've also just gone to the heart of the matter. So for instance, with the Strengthening Community Colleges grants in the round 2, those came out right after the first of many executive orders on this subject. And we knew at the beginning, you know, when it was time to develop this FOA, and it takes about 9 months to develop one of these, akin to having a child, it seems. So we knew that the administration would want to see that reflected in this funding opportunity announcement. So since these are capacity building grants, there was a natural fit. So we put addressing equity issues on the campus at the center of the FOA. And we asked colleges to identify and address equity gaps that directly or indirectly impact labor market outcomes for specific locally underserved communities. And we saw a lot of enthusiasm from our applicants around doing that.
Yeah, I mean, this whole, some of the things that you've lifted up, really around going out, hearing from stakeholders, working to address what you were hearing, making things easier, and at the same time, leveraging what you're hearing from policymakers and building into that executive order in order to be able to advance this work. It just, again, I think we can all learn from that at whatever level we're working around this. So I'm just wondering, and I'll go to Keisha again, are the outcomes of the work that you're engaged with maybe what you might have expected? Are you having to adapt your approach given an evolving political or legislative climate?
I think in some spaces, I've seen some encouraging and insightful things occur. That's why I mentioned it's important to celebrate small wins. I think when we do this work, we want to see grandiose change. We want to see systemic change happen like this. And you have to understand that systemic change occurred over an extensive period of time. So you're not going to change that overnight. And so one of the things that I stress is that you have to celebrate those small wins. You have to, the little things that if you were able to work with your marketing department and revamp all of your external marketing materials to be more diverse, to really demonstrate and showcase not only your campus community, but the community in which you serve, so that people see that they belong at your institution, that's a small win. For some people, that's not a win at all. And so I think that's why equally is important for you to educate around equity in action. So for me, the adaptation is coming from a place of, how do I get people to really see what this work is in action? And how does it show up in what you do every day? Because we can be honest, there has been an icing or chilling effect. I think people have utilized different language out of fear, right? When I think about North Carolina and some of the legislation we have, there are no consequences in our legislation. So it tells you, hey, you can't do this thing, but then it doesn't tell you what'll happen if you do this thing. So that puts people in a position to not know how to move. You get stuck. And it's not that you don't want to do anything, it's that you don't know what you could do. Again, which is why I created that toolkit for North Carolina community colleges, to really give them a space to, one, understand the legislation. I think that's another thing. That foundational knowledge, that having a clear understanding is extremely important of what has actually happened within your state. There's a lot of noise around. And you can get caught up in the varying noises beyond where you currently live and reside, and the communities in which you serve. So I think that's the other piece for me. Like yesterday, I did a state of DEI in North Carolina higher education session for community colleges, just so that I can debunk some of the myths that are out there, right? And really get people to a place of understanding, what does that legislation really say? What is it, and how does it really impact the work that you're doing? Not what you think, not what you assume, not what somebody told you, not what you heard, not what you saw on social media. What does it actually say? And then what does that translate into what you do every day on your campus? There's a methodology that I've tried to get people to think about when you have something like that you had no control over. And that's the what, so what, now what methodology and processing things, right? When you think about the legislation, what is it? What does it say? What is it? So what does that do? What does that mean? How does it impact me? And then the now what? The issue is, many of us stay in the what and the so what way too long. We never transition to the now what. We never transition to it exists. It's not going away. You can't get rid of it. It says what you can and cannot do. So what does that mean? So now what do I do? And so that's another thing that I think I've been trying to educate campuses around is, what can I do now? And then really talking about the art of pivoting. And what does that mean? You have to pivot. And this is a great opportunity for you to plan your pivot. I tell people all the time, our biggest pivot was COVID. Now think about, had you known about COVID before COVID came, and you were able to plan, you knew what it was, what it meant, and now you can plan for what it's going to be and how you're going to address COVID. How much better would our students' experiences would have been with online learning environment? How much better would it have been with our faculty and staff being able to transition from face-to-face, where they taught face-to-face for 30 years maybe, and now they have to teach an online class? Now, take that same premise and apply it to what's going on politically and socially. You know what's going on. Now begin to pivot, begin to plan for your pivot. What does that look like? How do you focus on universal values? How do you change language but not intent, depending on the state in which you reside? And so for me, that's the biggest pieces, along with, and this is my last thing because I don't want to take up too much time, but I challenge people to know what their capacity is to do this work, be honest and transparent about your institution, your community in which you serve, and their perception of equity and what equity means and what it means for your institution. A lot of times we live in a space that we think everything is great and we are great institutions and we have no problems and there are no issues and it's all happy kumbaya, and that is not the case all the time. And so you have to be transparent and honest, because you can't move work forward if you're not transparent about where you are and what your hurdles are going to be in order to progress and move the work forward. If you're not honest about that, that's why you keep hitting a wall. That's why things don't continue to move forward, because you're not being honest about your capacity. And I don't mean just human capacity, I mean institutional capacity to move the work forward. And then my last thing, thinking about organizational change theory. How does your organization change? How does your organization function during regular change? Let's take DEI out of it. When you got a regular change initiative coming through, how does your organization function? What does accountability look like? What does conflict resolution look like? What do all of those things look like? Now, if it's chaotic, disarray, people don't hold people accountable, there's no conflict resolution, y'all don't have crucial conversations, in a regular change, minus something as controversial, political, personal as diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging. Now you lay that on top of that dysfunction. That's another reason why stuff doesn't move forward. So in my work, it's not just about what is equity, diversity, and inclusion. It is, how does your institution function? And now how are we going to lay DEI on top of that? So I know I gave a long response.
No, that was amazing. And small wins, really understanding the facts, really thinking about pivoting and the so what, and being transparent and honest about where you are. I think, yeah, it's just so helpful to kind of hear that approach. And Jenny, I just kind of want to turn this to you a little bit, and based on what you're hearing from what DOL and Cheryl was describing earlier, what Keisha's talking about, how does this relate to kind of what you heard during your interviews with practitioners and policymakers?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, I think the teams that we spoke with, like, they're bought in, right? And some of them can very well articulate sort of the why, right? But they do exist in these chilling climates, and the chilling climate is not just happening sort of at the federal level, and it might not be new, right? There's a lot of things that can chill the pursuit of DEI on these college campuses. But I just want to say that I think, to Keisha's point, this idea of planning, right? Planning and the importance of capacity building, right? So sort of knowing what your capacity is, and then there being opportunities and resources and funding that help build that capacity. And I felt like I heard that both on the side of like what funders are doing and trying to do based off of what they're hearing from colleges and other grantees, but also hearing that from colleges saying, the challenge I would say is when I talk to colleges, I felt like the capacity to have these conversations to advance equity felt a lot more looking internally and messaging to your campus and within your system. Maybe that felt somewhat more comfortable or accessible. It's in those connections with partners who you're not sure what their values are or their priorities, or you do know, and in fact, they conflict with maybe your usual way of thinking about pursuing equity, that make it a challenge. And so I think thinking about how tools and resources to build capacity, the work that Cheryl's doing, strengthening community college grants is so important. Keisha, talking about all of your work and the toolkit is so important. So that's what I think of. Yeah, does resonate for sure.
Thanks. So, and Keisha, I think you addressed some of this in your last response, but I'm going to put it out to both you and Cheryl if you have more that you want to add. I just am wondering if there are any lessons learned or takeaways from the work that, in addition to what you've already shared, that you'd like to share with our audience at this point.
I have, but I'll let Cheryl go because I just finished talking.
Well, Thank you. I'm curious to hear what you've got. So lessons learned. It takes a lot more time and effort than, you might think going into it. Like, oh, great, we're going to do this thing. And, two brief examples on both sides of that. One is on the grantee side. So we said, okay, we're not going to tell you what your outcomes should be. This is in the second and third round of Strengthening Community Colleges grants. You tell us what your outcomes are going to be. But then when we got them, it wasn't always very clear exactly what that meant. And so we had to spend a lot of time going back and forth about, so what are you saying you're going to do here? Because otherwise, how can we, hold you accountable for doing that? And a lot of times it's just useful to help community colleges, I have found, to articulate for themselves, what are we going to do here? So that took a lot of time, and we decided not to do it that way again in rounds 4 and 5. This time we're trying something different. So talking about pivoting, which is to build in an internal process for the colleges to do a self-assessment once a year, to look at that question for themselves. It's not something that you have to tell us or prove to us, because we've got numbers, we've got disaggregated data that we can look at, and we've got a national evaluation that's going to look at that. We want you to look at it and build it in for yourself and practice and build your capacity to look at that. So we'll see if that pivot, where that one goes. I hope it goes in good places. I mean, internally for DOL, when you get a lot more new grantees without a lot of experience, it takes a lot more time to help and support those grantees to just understand the basics of how to do grants management, or how to do, what's an allowable cost and all of these kinds of things. So we're really having to do a lot of coaching and a lot of technical assistance around that. But it's really exciting to see what some of these newer grantees are doing as well. Keisha.
So I think for me, the first is around communication. We think we communicate very well, but in a lot of instances, we don't, in the sense that we're not communicating what is going on. We're not communicating our commitment, especially in this time. It is extremely important from an administrative perspective at your institutions to articulate what the commitment is to the work, or not, right? Instead of saying nothing, because that puts people in a position to not know, again, what they can and can't do. And then there's confusion and whether or not I should do anything. So then nothing happens. So I think communication is extremely important. But when you're doing the communication, as educators, we super smart, right? We went to school and, we talk from a super smart perspective. And I think that's where some of this is getting lost in translation. We're talking in different languages that people do not understand when we talk about the foundation of why this work even exists and why we're even having this conversation. I think our biggest issue is the difference between equality and equity. People don't know what it is, don't know what it means, do not know what it looks like in action. And so I think when you're communicating, you need to communicate and put everybody on the same playing field. So when you're talking about things and you're utilizing terms and you're rolling out things, everybody should know what you're talking about. You should not, whoever's communicating that message should not be the only one that knows all the background information about that. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that I've seen is the lack of clear communication about what is the commitment, and then what are we doing, so that we're on the same page. I think the other lesson learned for me is the why. If you think about adult learner theory, it says that adults, in order for us to buy into something, we need to know the why behind it, right? We work with adults every day, including your colleagues. We all adults. So when you think about when somebody comes to you and say, I'm gonna change your job, you're gonna do something different, outside of wanting to know whether or not you're going to get some more money in your paycheck, the other thing you want to know is why you changing my job. I can get with the what, the when, the where, and the how. After you communicate, naturally, I want to know why you're doing this thing. It's the same premise. We do not sing the same song at our institutions when it comes to this work. Everybody got their own reason as to why this work is important. And that's okay from a personal perspective. But from an institutional perspective, we need to be one band, one sound. We all singing the same song. It shouldn't, if I talk to Melissa, Cheryl, or Jenny, we should all be able to say, this is institutionally why this work is important and why we are doing this work. I think that it's important for us to think about people's experiences. So when you think about data-driven strategies or data-informed strategies, don't focus just on the numbers. My greatest example I like to give is that we know our men of color do not persist at our institutions at the same rate as their counterparts. We implement some things and we start to see they're being retained and they're completing. And we feel like, oh, we have done our work. We've closed equity gaps with men of color. But then if you were to talk to them about their experiences at your institution, their experiences may not match those outcomes of retention and persistence. Because if you think about marginalized populations, we're more likely to say nothing and deal with everything in a space just to reach our goals, right? And so just because you got good outcomes, it's equally important for you to look at the experience disparities and not just your outcome disparities to ensure that people are having good experiences in your space. And then my last thing is focus on your faculty and staff, not just from a professional development perspective on how to do this work, but from the lens that they matter as much as the student matters, that you want them to feel included in that environment, that you want them to feel like they belong, that they are not dealing with microaggressions, that they are not dealing with things. I think that's the part that gets missed in our work. Our mission, our vision, I know we're here to serve students, but if you think about Fortune 500 companies that thrive and do really well, it's because they pour into their employees. And that's why they have good customer service. Because if I feel good when I come to work every day, then that's going to translate into my interactions with people. So if you want to create inclusive environments where people feel like they belong, that starts with the people that work there first. That's why I think it's important that, my last thing, I promise. That's why I think it's important that sometimes it's not about your leadership doing education on what is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Sometimes your leadership, in order to move those efforts forward, need professional development on emotional intelligence, on crucial conversations, on leading change, on leaders eat last. They need to develop professionally in order to move this kind of initiative forward, because all of those things play into equity, whether we think they do or not. We don't talk about them. So that's why many times we focus on other things, but you have to deal with your foundations first. Otherwise, everything else is going to be shaky and you're never going to bear the fruit of what you're trying to do at the end of the day. I'll be quiet.
Well, thank you so much. And you kept apologizing, Keisha, but actually all of the information that you, all three of you have been sharing, I just think has been so helpful. What I'd like to do now is kind of shift over to questions and answers. And we do have, Michelle Rafferty has posted a question. This is probably covered in the report, but I'm curious if all the research was conducted after the affirmative action SCOTUS decision, and also wondering if that's what prompted you all to design and conduct the study. And I will just put this out there to you, Michelle, and let you know that we first started, and this project started in the fall of 2022. So it was before the SCOTUS decision. Although, and I'll turn it to Jenny a little bit also to respond to this, I think as we were watching the evolution of what was taking place in, given the SCOTUS decision, given all the legislation underway, that definitely had implications, I think, for the approach to the data gathering and research. Jenny, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that's true. I just would say that if I were to add anything, it would be about the design of the research. And I think there's a way that it's responsive to the climate and what's going on, but there's also a way in which it's responsive to what we were hearing, right? And more of that is in the report too. But hearing things like strategy, the way colleges are advancing equity with different partners varies. And perhaps we went in almost exclusively thinking, well, the external climate looms large, Supreme Court decisions loom large, local politics loom large. And while that's true, there are also a lot of other things going on, including a lot of what I talked about today, which is trying to match the values of your external partners in particular, where it can be challenging while you're pursuing equity. So I just wanted to share that too.
Well, I'm going to give you all a chance to ask. Oh, Cheryl, did you want to say something?
Oh, I just
Oh.
wanted to know when you posted that DOL study, did everybody see that, or did that only go to the person who asked about that link? I can't tell from where I'm sitting.
Everybody should be able to see it in the question and answer box under the answered tab, but I'm also going to share it again in the chat for everybody, just in case.
Thank you. So I'm going to give people 1 more minute to post questions, and what I'll do during that time is ask Keisha and Cheryl to each take 30 seconds to talk to us if you would like to share about like what's next.
Sure. Just briefly, we're continuing to evolve our efforts, trying to measure what comes out of all of this. It's very hard, as you all know, but we're also involved in some bigger cross-agency actions. So there is a movement afoot among federal agencies to, guess what, to simplify funding opportunity announcements, or NOFAs, or whatever we all call them. That is, you can imagine, is harder than, who was it, Mark Twain or somebody said it's harder to write a short letter than a long one. But anyway, we're trying anyway, because I think there's definitely lots of room for improvement there. And then also there's updated uniform guidance and things like that. So just sort of at a larger level, I mean, yes, we're continuing all those other things I mentioned, but those are some bigger things too.
For me, it's just 3 things. Helping people figure out that equity in action piece. I'm working on a art of pivoting toolkit to help people work through how to pivot, and then the art of storytelling as well to kind of complement that. So those 2 things will go together, because I think we don't tell our stories in the best ways to help people understand why the work is important. So working on a toolkit for that, and we'll be releasing the Inclusive Excellence Framework to colleges that kind of outlines how to do the work.
Wonderful.
I
Well,
love that art of pivoting toolkit.
yes.
I want that.
Yes, I know. I want it too. So I would ask everyone to join me in thanking our panelists, Keisha Jones, Cheryl Martin, Jenny Poole. So appreciate all of the expertise that you shared with us today. And at this point, I'd like to turn it back over to Keisha.
Thanks again. NEKC Foundation and you all for being here. And so as we close out, I have to ask, now what? I love that. And a couple of things we heard, Cheryl mentioned, it takes continued dialogue, meaning making, it takes TA. And so those are some things to consider as you enter into your work, or how you support. I know there's funders on here as well, support grantees and others in diving deeper. So we want to continue to pursue this work in research and practice. And one of the things we're interested in doing further is understanding the metrics that can support colleges and their partners coming together to advance equity in multiple ways. And so we, encourage everyone to join in the band. That's another snippets I'm taking from here. So how can we play different roles and instruments, but it goes together beautifully to make a beautiful song. And so we're interested in partnering on work and advancing equity as the notion of place-based fairness, given that we see this as increasingly a sustainable way to advance and message equity in the changing DEI landscape. We've gotten some questions and asks of funders through this research that we saw, the questions for them are around, first, to continue offering flexible funding opportunities that support the capacity building and the work around messaging. So that flexible funding support is crucial. Second, help building a stronger evidence-based approaches on what works for colleges and their partners, especially when collaborating with employers. You know, again, what's the roles we each can play in building up to this beautiful song, and employers play a key part. Continuing to build the capacity of colleges' data systems and understanding how they use it. What's the meaning making behind it? What does this mean is important. And for everyone on the call, we ask that you continue to reach out to us in different ways. Most of us, I think we know many of you on the call, so don't be a stranger. And if we don't, we'd love to meet you to continue the conversation so that there can be additional and continued investments financially, but in other ways, building evidence, building understanding. So again, thank you. The report is here. You can download that here using QR code. Thanks, Annie Casey, for supporting the work, and thank you all for joining us today.